Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Just by way of introduction, my name's Julian Hetherington, and I'm Automotive Transformation Director here at the Advanced Propulsion Centre. And the Tech Trends team, ably represented by Chris Jones to my right here, is going to be hosting this session today to talk us through this really vital and important subject, and one which is probably very apposite given government's current focus on critical minerals, and more of that a little bit later. I'd like to say a really big welcome and thank you especially to our panelists sat up here at the front for our entertainment and active discussion this morning. And really appreciate you coming here as well today, because I know traffic is not great first thing on a Monday morning, especially around the university campus. So thank you for making the effort. It's really important that we get good feedback from stakeholders such as yourselves as we run these debates to try and inform what we do and also what others do as a result of garnering this information. Now, we've got two panels today, one focusing on end of life and the other on life cycle assessment. And these build really on some of the activity that we started and announced our intent at our Westminster reception a little earlier in the year. And these are two topics that really clearly interact with one another. In fact, each could themselves be a driver for the other. Now, we've got a really big challenge as we decarbonise, as we move into an era, where we are at a vehicle level, dealing with technologies that are fundamentally more materials intense than those technologies that we are replacing. Largely the materials for internal combustion engines and conventional drivelines sat around aluminium and iron derivatives. But we're now moving into materials that are a bit more difficult to extract. They're a bit more difficult, a lot more difficult, some would say, to recover at the end of life. And we haven't yet had 100 years of polishing the apple, if you like, of learning how to use these technologies to get to higher levels of efficiency in every step of the value chain, and looking at getting to a circular materials economy for these new materials. And of course, we've got the challenge of advancing technologies, which means that materials that are used today, for example, in batteries, might not be used at some point in the future. There's an argument that says nickel-rich technology is the technology of today, but maybe we'll move to other things. Maybe we'll move to different anode materials, for example, and avoid the use of graphite. And this, of course, has a destabilizing effect on the upstream supply for these interesting materials. So we've got to develop the roadmaps as well to help the wider industry beyond automotive directly and into the upstream materials supply space, for example, into the mining community, so that they've got an idea of the trajectory that we're taking and the volumes that will be required going forwards, because very often their investment timelines are significantly longer, with lead times for equipment and to bring on mining assets significantly longer than the downstream processing, even vehicle assembly. Now, we've also got to guard against some of the unintended consequences of trying to drive towards net zero from a carbon perspective. We know that electric vehicles, provided that our energy systems around the world can generate clean electricity, can be significantly less carbon intensive over their lifetime than internal combustion engine vehicles. But as we go through the process of designing vehicles, designing them to be functionally excellent in performance terms, designing them to be easy to manufacture and cost-effective to manufacture, we've also got to think about what happens at the end of life. We've got to think about how we avoid losing those precious materials that we embed in these new technologies and get them back into the system, so we have much more of a circular materials economy. The opportunity is right now for us to work in this space, to learn how to design vehicles and vehicle systems and battery systems such that we can recover the materials and we can reuse them economically, and that we're not just creating a problem for the future, avoiding those potential unintended consequences. It's incumbent upon us as an industry to do that and to do it expediently so that we don't lock things up that we can't get back in just a few years from now. Now, this is perhaps especially important for the UK. We are unfortunately not blessed with all of these materials that we need underneath our feet in terra firma. So we are reliant on a global network to bring together all of those important minerals and processed intermediates so that we can use them and embed them in the battery systems that we need for our vehicles going forwards. Now, I'm really delighted that government has taken a very strong view on critical minerals and has established a critical minerals strategy last year and refreshed it again earlier this year. And it's being personally sponsored by Minister Ghani, whom I'm meeting this afternoon again, as she's established a task force, a task and finish group on critical minerals. And it's looking at the entire ecosystem, but with a particular focus, not just on where can we get the materials from, but on how does industry, through its extended value chains, build resilience in those supply chains, considering also recycling and materials recovery, so that we do not ever undermine the industry's ability to support the production of new vehicles and other systems that use these critical materials across other industrial sectors as well. Now that's really important, and it's a fantastic initiative and one that I'm very pleased to have been invited to participate in. Thanks very much again for attending, and I hope that you have a really great debate today. So thanks again.
Okay, thanks, Julian. Right, I'm Chris Jones. I'm Strategic Trends Manager at the Advanced Propulsion Centre. My background is mostly in materials science, so I tend to get quite excited about material supply chains and recycling of materials. Thus, I'm leading this event today. So, to start off, can each of you introduce yourselves, tell us about the companies or organisations you work for and your interest in life cycle analysis, please. Sarah?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah, co-founder and CEO of a company called Infios. My background is working in mined materials supply chains, helping the industry to work with their supply chain end to end to make it as sustainable and responsibly sourced as possible. Initially worked in diamond supply chains and then across into the mined materials going into batteries. And at Infios, we're focused with working with industry to help them understand the ESG impacts and risks of their supply chain and make sure that they are complying with regulation, but also pushing forward to make their battery supply chains as sustainable as possible.
Rachel?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel Waugh, Principal Consultant at Oak Dean Hollins, which is a circular economy consultancy. My own background is in manufacturing engineering, predominantly looking at decarbonising the steel and aluminium global supply chains. At Oak Dean Hollins, we work with a range of organisations, private sector, trade associations and government, looking at a wide range of ways to improve the circularity of the way that we produce, use and make products. And in terms of interest in the battery space, we've recently been involved in a study for DEFRA collating the evidence base that's feeding into their impact assessment as part of the ongoing review of battery regulations in the UK.
Shahin?
Hello everyone, I'm Shahin. I'm working for a company called Minviro, and we are a lifecycle assessment software and consultancy company. In our software business, we are developing software for mining industry, especially mining industry and battery raw materials industry, to develop their own LCAs and draw like roadmaps to reduce their carbon emissions. And my background is in mining engineering and mining environmental management, and I'm mainly right now working with the end of life of batteries and raw materials.
Seb?
Hi, I'm Seb. I'm the co-founder of Twist. I have a background in industrial design and behavioral economics. Twist exists because we felt the pain of life cycle assessments being or becoming a bit of like a tick boxing exercise, expensive. So we have built a software that allows you to track live emissions of primarily e-mobility products. And then we have a financing part of it as well, but it's boring, so I won't talk about that.
And Jacqueline?
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Edge. I'm a battery scientist working in the Faraday Institution. I work at Imperial College and I also on the Relib project on recycling. My focus in my work is techno-economics and life cycle assessment of batteries, and I'm trying to make sure that we take the holistic perspective and consider all aspects of the battery value chain and the full circularity of it.
All right, thanks everyone. So first of all, Sarah, I'm wondering if you could talk us through the EU Battery Directive a little bit and what that means for LCA. How is that driving adoption of life cycle analysis?
Of course. Yeah, so right now we have in place the EU Battery Directive, which has been in place for a number of years, and coming into place at the beginning of next year is the EU Battery Regulation. And so that was actually finalized just under a week ago. So very good timing for this conversation. And this regulation is much more comprehensive than the directive that currently exists today. It covers a kind of a high-level product performance, reporting, and sustainability. Under sustainability is life cycle assessments, but also supply chain due diligence and circularity, recycling, and extended producer responsibility. And so I can maybe pass the mic to you to discuss the life cycle assessment aspects, but I think the really interesting thing about the sustainability requirements of this regulation is that they are some of the most comprehensive sustainability requirements of any industry and most regulations. And I think the reason why they have come into place is because there's been a huge kind of pushback from the industry recognizing that if we want to make this transition towards clean energy and clean mobility, people looking into the supply chains look and realize, actually, is this really a cleaner alternative? I think Julian pointed to some of the challenges around where we're getting resources from, the energy intensity of the production process, the challenges around responsible sourcing of some of these raw materials from high conflict, high risk zones, and a huge number of other challenges. And so I think that's where the industry is really recognizing that if we want to make this transition as quickly as possible, we also need to be ahead of addressing these challenges that we're getting from a consumer end of, is this really a sustainable alternative? And so this is kind of part of the driving force of this EU battery regulation, is to set an industry standard on what does it look like to be a sustainable battery. And so that includes running life cycle assessments, but that also includes having the supply chain due diligence policies and processes in place with your suppliers to be able to know what are the key ESG impacts in your supply chain, how do we mitigate against those, and then it also includes looking at how do we move from a linear supply chain to a circular supply chain, both because of the resource security challenges, but also because of the wider sustainability challenges that we have in minimizing resource consumption as much as possible. But yeah, I won't go into too much detail from the LCA perspective because I think you'll be even better at doing that.
Hopefully. So in EU battery regulation, I'm personally very excited about that regulation because for the first time in our economic applications, it brings the whole life cycle thinking into the perspective. And it has like 79 articles, and in the Article 7, it dictates that all the battery manufacturers should be responsible for the declaring and at the end of the regulation reducing their carbon footprints. This is really important for like our industry. And this Article 7 for the first time provides the boundaries of that life cycle assessment, and it creates like a standard model for the life cycle assessments. And everyone in this room is kind of aware of that, the fact that life cycle assessment might be quite complicated and might require so many like data, resources, and time. And we need to have like standards, and we need to have regulations that kind of incentivize those standards. And EU battery regulations does that, I think, quite fairly. And another important aspect of the battery regulation is Article 8, which is giving targets for the recycled content of batteries. So we should be targeting those recycled contents, and it's going to be discussed in the afternoon. But it, for the first time, gives that you need to be responsible for the product that you are putting into the market at the end of its life. And yeah, I think that's really powerful. And also there is battery passports, and battery passports puts into perspective that a producer should be declaring their information, raw material sourcing information, and all other like labeling information in their products, and it should be available by public. And that is really powerful as well, because public should be aware of the products that they're using and its own impacts, so that they can like target reducing those impacts. And yeah, there are lots of other issues as well, but I don't want to keep it too long.
Yeah, I think the one other thing I would add on top of your comments around the LCA, I think one of the really interesting aspects that the LCA requirements have is initially it's about reporting your LCA, having that third party verified, but then the next step is the classification of LCA performance, and then the next step after that is going to be setting maximum thresholds for LCA performance, or
Sure.
minimum maximum thresholds. And I think that's something that I don't see across many other regulations, is not just you have to be transparent about it, but we're actually going to start benchmarking product performance on it, and we're going to say there is a minimum standard you have to meet in order to be able to put your batteries onto the European market.
Yeah, like the reason why is that so important is because battery manufacturers are now required to track their own products and track that what's going to happen at the end of that product, which is quite powerful, like in this economical space.
And do you think it will go beyond batteries eventually? So batteries is sort of leading the way, but will this go to the whole car eventually?
Sure. And it's not just like EVs as well. It's going to be extended into the railroads and like all those like critical metals and critical industries and solar panels, wind turbines. And yeah, like that's really important for us to start the business and lead the way.
Rachel, we just heard the words battery passport. Would you be able to explain what that means a little bit, please?
Yes, so this is a requirement to be able to store the information that you're collecting as part of the requirements for the battery regulation, and present it in a standardised way. So the ambition longer term is to have a QR code, I believe, as the mechanism for interrogating that. There are some intermediary measures for reporting while we're finalising the format for that. And that's a really interesting concept, as you sort of mentioned about opportunities to expand into other products. And the battery passport, I think, as well, is another area where we're going to see this approach, this structure, this format to how you report, store, and transfer data along the supply chain is going to be applicable to a wide range of products and sectors. So it's really exciting to see the path being forged in the battery space.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it all sounds really complex. And I think what's great is we've got some companies represented here that offer services that can really help. So I think what would be nice is to just dive a little deeper into what you do, and perhaps give us an example of some work that you've done. So Seb, what the Twist do?
Yeah. So what we do, we essentially have two parts of Twist, and the one that we'll focus primarily on is the data analytics platform, which is what we've found when we started out Twist is that lifecycle assessments is cumbersome, they can sometimes be expensive and not necessarily treated the way that they should be treated, that we understand them, which is a force for change. So you do an analysis, you then see what the impact is, and then you make choices based on that. So what we have done is that we have taken away the steps that most of our customers find the most cumbersome, which is data gathering and data analysis. So we offer that completely for free when you sign up. And then we provide what we call like a lifecycle assessment platform. So you can see the performance of your products. We work primarily with e-mobility and robotics in a live setting. So you can see how much emissions they're producing, and other types of like economic performances, such as when are they used, when they're not used, serviced, maintenance. And the importance of that is that it does actually change behavioral directly, because you would potentially have different types of use cases where your batteries or your other components will be used more heavily or more lightly, and you can make strategies based on that. So either move a battery from one use to a second use, or have like a better end-of-life strategy for them. We really want to work with the battery manufacturers directly, because we think that there is and especially what this new regulation offers, which is extended producer responsibility, where they will also want to see in a live environment how their batteries are performing and being able to make decisions right there rather than just once a year. We also use the same data to educate and help financial institutions to invest and finance more greener hardware as a service or circular business models. So yeah, that's like a bit short what we do, basically bringing the LCA live.
Thank you. And Shahin, what about Minviro?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a mining targeted company. And we first need to recognize that LCA is not specifically structured for mining industry. It's like originated from somewhere else. And LCA literacy in mining industry is not that high. So, and most of the like on-the-shelf LCA software are quite complicated for a non-expert to understand and navigate through. So we have developed that simple to use MineLCA platform where mining companies, refineries, processors can quantify the impacts of their product from cradle to gate. And then we have another product called MineBit, which is targeted for the battery manufacturers and OEMs, in which a user can map out their own supply chains, and they can, let's say they are working with a lithium company, lithium mine in Chile, and they can set targets for that Chile company to quantify their impacts, and those impacts can be integrated to the battery manufacturer supply chains. So we are connecting that cradle to gate with the gate to gate. And then we have another tool called MineNoob. There are lots of mines. And with the MineNoob, you can then integrate the end-of-life impacts. And if you are familiar with the end-of-life LCIs, they can be quite complicated. And yeah, there are lots of different approaches to apply it from. So those tools are drawing the boundaries for cradle to cradle or a cradle to grave LCA to be completed from the perspective of different players in the supply chain.
And Sarah?
Yes, so at Invios, we work primarily with companies manufacturing batteries or in the midstream to downstream aspect of the battery supply chain, as well as the companies buying batteries. So for example, renewable energy asset managers buying batteries for the renewable energy sites. And we work kind of on two key areas. One is, what does industry best practice for ESG and sustainability look like for me as a company and for my supply chain? And then the second question is, how do I make sure that my company and my supply chain is ready for all of this regulation? That's the EU battery regulation, but it's also a huge amount of other regulation, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the EU Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, Modern Slavery Act, Weaker Forced Labor Act, a very long list of regulation. And one of the big challenges that we saw when we were first working in the industry was that if you're a small to medium-sized company, and to be honest, even if you're a large company, staying on top of what are the biggest ESG impacts and what are the key regulations in place today, but also in a month's time when the regulation has now changed, what are the key regulations and how am I performing on my ESG impacts and my regulations? And so through a combination of software and in-house expertise, we help the companies understand where are your biggest risks, how are you performing today, what does the pathway forwards need to look like for you, and how do you manage that both internally with your company, but also engaging with your suppliers to manage that at a supplier company level, but also a product level. And so in turn, that means helping them get ready for the EU battery regulation alongside these other regulations so that they don't have a kind of single-minded approach for one regulation, but also helping them get ready for LCAs alongside supply chain due diligence responsible sourcing. So you're not making a decision that's going to be great for your carbon impact, but then expose you to a huge amount of water scarcity issues or indigenous community rights issues. And so helping to build that big picture system level thinking and design into how do we help companies implement best practice on sustainability and get ahead of the regulation.
Great, so that's a really good point. We talk about carbon a lot and reducing carbon. And you just mentioned ESG responsibilities and other issues. So maybe we can just touch on what is ESG. And when we talk about life cycle analysis, what are we actually talking about? What is a life cycle and what are we trying to measure?
Yeah. So what is ESG? So ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. It originated initially, actually, off the backbone of CSR, which was kind of the predecessor to ESG, which stands for corporate social responsibility. And so corporate social responsibility came into the world where companies recognize, okay, we're a big company with a huge amount of impact, building a lot of profits. How do we effectively give back in the world? And so they would set up charitable foundations, they would donate to charity, but those activities generally tended to be quite separate to the impacts of their business as a whole. So they might set up a foundation educating children in one country, even though none of their business was actually related to that country. And so on the back of that, the next step was moving into this ESG framework, which was recognizing that I, as a company, am creating negative impacts and exposed to negative risks. And so that could be exposed to child labor in my cobalt supply chain. It could be exposed to water scarcity in my lithium supply chain, so on and so forth. And so then it was about how do I minimize those negative impacts as much as possible by implementing programs at a company level, but also then gradually at a supply chain level as well. And then we've moved from ESG more into this world of sustainability. And in some ways, it's just terminology that often gets interchanged with each other. But the key difference from a sustainability lens is it's not just about how do I minimize my negative impacts as much as possible, but it's also about how do I minimize negative impacts whilst maximizing the positive impacts of what I'm doing as much as possible. I think from a battery perspective, that's really, really important, because in this world that we're moving towards, where we're having a very rapid transition towards battery-powered technology for mobility and also for clean energy, there's a huge opportunity to not do things the way we've always been doing them, and actually think about how do I have a positive impact as I'm making this transition? How do I create new jobs, not just minimize the negative impacts of jobs that will be lost, so on and so forth. And so often, to be honest, ESG and sustainability do still get used interchangeably for many reasons, and in some ways it doesn't matter, because there's no point in getting caught up in semantics. And then from an LCA perspective, as you said, carbon often gets the kind of first point of, this is main topic of conversation often, is how do we get to net zero as quickly as possible? And that's really looking at carbon emissions. But LCA broadly is about a lot more than just carbon emissions. It's other environmental impacts. But I think the key thing to point out is mostly looking at environmental impacts, not social or governance impacts. And so that's where we've seen combining the analysis on an LCA perspective with also other analysis of other social and governance impacts is really important in making sure that you don't make unintended consequences from the actions you're taking around sustainability. But I'm happy to hand over to you if you want to dive more into the specifics of LCA as well.
Yeah, sure. I'm not going to tell much because you explained that perfectly. Just kind of taking a step back and understanding the LCA is that LCA is our reflection of our economic activities on the environment. So it's just like a tool, it's a measurement tool that is kind of bridging environment and our economy. And when we say LCA, we mainly talk about like environmental LCAs, but also this is kind of originating from the life cycle thinking. So our economic activities also have social impacts and also have other like cost-related impacts. And these should be integrated together when we are talking about sustainability. Just kind of wanted to clear that space. And it's very different from carbon accounting, because carbon accounting is just quantifying the carbon of a product or a company. Yeah, that's just that.
Absolutely, yeah. And Jacqueline, so if I want to do a life cycle assessment, where do I start?
So the first thing would be to consider all the actual activities that your company does, the products it makes, the activities such as transporting things around, offices, and all the places where you might have an impact on the environment. And then you would have to consider try and quantify the greenhouse gas emissions, the water use of chemicals, etc., on all of those activities and products, and then account all of that together, and that would be your Scope 1 emissions. And then you would want to have to look further into your upstream and downstream supply chain and try and assess all of the impacts that they have. So that means that they'll all have done their Scope 1 emissions. And then it all ties together and adds up to tell you what your life cycle assessment is up to a certain point, or across the whole life cycle, or even right the way through to recycled products. So it's a step-by-step thing. It's very complicated, but we need to do it.
Absolutely. And Shahin, you mentioned there are software tools that we can use, and there are also organizations that can help. So how do I pick a software tool? How do I pick a company to work with?
That's a great question. I shouldn't be favoring on my company right now. But again, as I mentioned, it can be very complicated for non-experts, LCAs. But if I'm being honest, it's just like an arithmetic calculation. So you don't need to go too complicated with it. You need to know your own inventory, your own boundaries, and then you need to find a software that can quantify those impacts. And for non-experts, it should be just simple to use. It shouldn't be too expensive, and it should be accessible to everyone in the company. And that's what I would look for at LCA software.
And what are the challenges when you're trying to do this?
Data. I love this word. Yeah, like we have lots of issues with again, LCA is not specifically originated from the industries that we are dealing with right now. So the data is very scarce, and we have lots of issues with the intellectual properties because companies, they don't want to share their own data. So we need to push industrial stewardships or like data collection and data sharing organizations to find the minimum data to measure some impacts of a product. So yeah, data is a huge problem.
Thanks. And Jacqueline, I hear about standardization quite a lot. But we have an ISO standard if you're measuring carbon as the greenhouse gas protocol. There are other standards coming from Fit for 55, possibly from the battery regulation. So when we say we need standardization, what are we actually asking for?
So life cycle assessment is a very powerful tool for tracking and monitoring the impacts of products and services. There are two big problems when we try and apply it to batteries. Life cycle assessment is designed to be generic for any product or any service. And so there's certain unique characteristics about batteries that we then need to take into account when we do a life cycle assessment on a battery. The other problem is that life cycle assessment has a lot of flexibility built into it, so the practitioner can always decide, well, how am I can limit the boundary, I can disregard certain elements, I can only focus on certain impact factors. And so that means that one study might be done where they've only looked at what their actual production emissions are, but they've ignored transport and logistics. And another study might have included that. So then those two studies will be fundamentally different. They'll come up with different results. And it's very hard to then compare them. So we need standards to make sure that when people do an LCA study on a battery, they're doing it in a consistent manner. They're taking into account all the different aspects that will impact that eventual result. And that they're not ignoring certain logistics, they're not ignoring certain elements of the life cycle. So it's just really important that we standardize that, and the EU has already been working for more than a decade on doing exactly that. They've been developing something called Product Environmental Footprint, which is trying to make that life cycle assessment method more applicable, so it's a bit more like a cookie-cutter application. And that means that you can apply the same method to two different manufacturers, and you can have comparable results. And that's really important, because the key thing is we need to be able to say, well, is this battery made by this company better than this one? And that's why. And there is one other area we need standardizations on, and that is battery pack design. For example, at the moment, every car manufacturer is making their own battery packs, and they're quite secretive about how they make those. But in order to recover those materials, we have to take those packs apart. And if every pack is a completely different design, it's very difficult to do that. It's very expensive because you have to then first reverse engineer the pack, work out how you're going to dismantle it. You don't know what's in it. And so if we could standardize on pack design, that would certainly help recyclers to more cost-effectively recycle and recover those materials.
Okay. And Shahin, you mentioned data as a challenge. So if LCA becomes a requirement for the battery supply chain, is that the main challenge, and what can we do about it?
If we are talking about the EU battery regulations and going forward from there, in the supporting documents of the battery regulation, there are lots of extensive data-related chapters. And if a battery manufacturer wants to be in the EU market and wants to declare their carbon footprint, they need, in the regulation, there are different levels of data responsibilities. So manufacturers should be responsible for declaring that data as well. So how they separate this is mandatory data and non-mandatory data. In mandatory data, if you are talking about like cell chemistry data, which is mostly the environmental hotspot in the battery supply chain, the declarant, the battery manufacturer, should contact to their suppliers and should get the primary data from them. If they don't do that, they're not going to be able to sell their products in the market. So I think a powerful way of pushing this is to connect different players of supply chains and kind of create this communication and these standards for them to be able to communicate. And we have already started doing that. And another point is this non-mandatory data, which can be sourced from the secondary data, not non-company specific secondary data. In that space, we need to really push forward for the literature data to be available and like these organizational data to be available to create at least some minimum level of LCA requirements available. Hope that made sense for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And Rachel, you mentioned DEFRA consultation at the start. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that work?
Yes, so this study that we put together was drawing together the evidence really on the costs and benefits of potential different approaches for treatment of batteries, and looking at things like if the UK were to adopt similar regulation to the EU, what would the impact of that be? And how do stakeholders feel? Would they like to see us aiming higher? Would there be any benefits to changing it? So it was an exercise really drawing together evidence from literature and also from stakeholders, which then feeds into DEFRA's impact assessment, looking at what would be the impact of different policy options. And these will then go out for consultation. So this is going to be an ongoing process that it would be great for lots of people to get involved with. And some of the conversations that we were having with stakeholders very much touched on these issues around what are the costs and benefits of collecting data. And obviously an important concern that people have is the costs around collecting data. And one of the things that came through very strongly was the view that data is really important, but we must be really clear why we're collecting the data and how we're going to use it. And so I think it's really interesting seeing what's coming out of the EU in terms of their proposals, and there's some opportunities there to look at how we can use that in the UK. Interesting as well, looking at things like end of life, which we're going to look at later in terms of what are the different approaches you could take to trying to encourage different behaviours. And I think in the EU regulation that the door's quite wide open really in terms of how that might be approached, particularly things like repurposing of batteries. And so that's a really interesting potential space for the UK to explore how we might approach that going forwards.
Thank you. We've heard a lot of information so far from the panel. I wonder if anyone in the audience has any questions. We're going to have to do a bit of mic juggling. This is going to be interesting. There we go. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, Etienne Dodain from the UK Automotive Council. The OEMs recognize that there is a high degree of involvement in making things better. But it seems that there is a bit of a disconnect as to the task that has been given to the OEMs to align with all these new things. In the past, there is a consensus as to the fact that the elements comprised in an ICE vehicle were not to be communicated so widely in terms of data, origins, and everything. And all of a sudden, we've got to comply with a number of sort of transparency, which is also in a very high contradiction level with the intellectual property rights. So it's very difficult to, on the one hand, to being rushed in one direction that we have to meet, and on the other hand, to juggle with all the different parameters which are either for non-mandatory or mandatory. Things are piling up very quickly. That's what I'm trying to say here on behalf of the OEMs and the tier suppliers. And on the one hand, we would encourage people like you guys to talk to us and help in redefining the landscape of the obligations and with a set parameter in terms of the timing, because the technology is there, but we have the contradictory elements to base the data on. And certainly, as far as communicating data, this is going to be a massive hurdle for you guys to break, because I don't see how the OEMs will divulge their supply chain elements. There are some pirates out there in the field of the web, which I cannot mention, but it's creating havoc and also undermines the credibility of the national institutions trying to harness this data.
So I think there's a really good points there, and I think there's a real challenge when it comes to security of data and transparency. But also, I think there's an opportunity in the UK, and we've got a few companies represented here who can really help through these challenges. So I wonder who would like to comment first on that.
I can add a couple comments. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge that we see, is this balance and trade-off between transparency of data and security of data, and also protecting a competitive industry. One of the key things to point out is that data, the permissioning access to data is essential. So as part of some of this regulation, yes, you're going to need to have public transparency on certain data and certain outputs. But as other aspects of the regulation, you will need to be able to be reporting on the outputs. So for example, like the ESG impact analysis that you've done and the mitigation plan, but you won't necessarily need to report on all the inputs that you found into that. And so whilst you internally as a company might want to have build your data structure in such a way where you can internally manage that, when it comes to actually externalizing that, that's where making sure that you have the right data controls and permissions so that the sensitive data stays internal and only what you need to put external becomes external is key.
Just a tiny comment. This is not like my strong suite, but when we are talking about data and these like regulatory framework of data, there are different levels of data sharing with the public. There is like public data to be shared, which gives like the very generic information, and there is non-public data shared with the authorities. So I don't think this space would kind of risk the data breaches. I don't think that would happen in the future.
I guess if you're concerned about data security and you're looking for a company to work with, is there something you can look for that will give you confidence that your data will be secured, the underlying data?
I think loads of the even big companies that we work for, they do things like self-assessments on their third-party suppliers beforehand, so that you can assess whether or not their security is on par with what you're expecting. And I think you mentioned GDPR, which I think is an interesting angle, because it doesn't really cover bases for companies or OEMs that operate primarily B2B, so there's a lot less regulation around gathering data in B2B, which is both an opportunity, but also, I guess, like a bit of a risk. And I agree with Shane. I think when it comes to breaching data, I think when it comes to this type of data gathering, unless it's personal information, I don't think it's a particularly high risk that people would want to know what the uptime of a battery is, unless they may be stealing that data. But there's loads of ways that you can also aggregate and anonymize within your internal processes. But yeah, I don't think it's a high risk as I think that the media and the industry is pointing it out to be.
So I'd just like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to offer an opportunity for a final thought from each one before we say thank you. So Jacqueline, final thought from you?
So I want to pick up on what you mentioned about reforestation. While we're focusing so much on global warming, we should also make sure we're not damaging ecosystems anymore, and we're actually trying to recover them as much as possible, because they are very effective carbon sinks. And so it's where we put our mines is really important, how we expand them, the mining methods we use. Where we put our gigafactories and our infrastructure, we should be bearing that in mind, is do not damage ecosystems, rule number one.
Seb?
How do we follow that? I think that overall, I think that what regulations and what data is providing is putting an equal importance on reporting on sustainability as it does to your financial reporting. And I think that's what we need to head.
Shahin?
Just like on a positive note, I think this is a very exciting space to be in right now, because we are pushing the boundaries of our understanding of our economy and environment. And we shouldn't be getting like a bit pessimist about it, because it's still, as long as we have done lots of work, but it's still in its embryonic phase, and we have lots of work to do in the future. Yeah, that's my reflection.
Thanks. Rachel?
Mine is just picking up, I think, on the point about how LCA and looking at things from that life cycle perspective can be an opportunity, and not to be scared by the scale of the task. Starting with some data is better than none. Starting those conversations with suppliers who might be behind is better than starting them later on. And so looking at those opportunities. And then my only other slight sort of controversial point really is that when you're looking at your life cycle assessment and you have your functional unit, it's easy to forget that you need to multiply that by a number, and actually you could look at demand reduction as a really powerful tool for reducing impact as well.
Sarah?
I think one of the key things that I think you somewhat touched on is this opportunity that we have to move very quickly. I would say also the big factor that we see at play is that a lot of conversations in such a technical topic can take a very long time to have, and we actually don't have that time. And so it's really important that, yes, we get industry collaboration with government and regulation collaboration and, having multiple stakeholders involved. And by nature, that does take time, but we need to look at ways for making those decisions as quickly as possible, especially in this global landscape where we have the European battery regulation coming out, but it's uncertain what the UK is going to do on that. We have the Inflation Reduction Act out, but it's uncertain what Europe's response is going to be on that, never mind what the UK's response is going to be on that. And so I think it's really critical that we focus on what are the biggest challenges that we have here and how do we move as quickly as possible towards those, because we don't have time to spend the next 2 years deciding what the approach is going to be.
Brilliant, thank you. What we do have time for is lunch. So we are very lucky to have so much knowledge on the panel. I'm sure they're happy to talk to you over lunch, but please do let them eat. And finally, can we just say thank you to everybody?